So with this, another warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us from your diverse locations. My name is Ute Steiker. I direct the European Institute at UCL, and it is really my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's event and to welcome our wonderful panel to tonight's event. I will leave it to Olesya later on to introduce them individually. We're really very glad to be partnering tonight with UCL's School of Slavonic and East European Studies, SSEES. And I would be amiss if I didn't encourage you to follow also their SSEES Now event series, which has a huge range of dedicated and very interesting events, many of them to do with Ukraine and the Russian invasion and surrounding considerations. Let me also refer to you while I'm at it to the European Institute's outputs around Europe, including the current war, among others on the UCL Europe blog, which we curate and which we seek to bring together academic voices from across disciplines, as well as voices from the field, to investigate and explore a variety of issues as they pertain to Europe. Now, tonight's event is one obviously in a series of, I should say, events, conversations, debates we'll all be engaging with that looks at recent events since February's, so the Russian Federation invading Ukraine. All of us have engaged in various ways in a multiplicity of debates surrounding this event. But in particular today, what we would like to explore with our panelists is the role Europe, broadly conceived, has played so far, and what Ukraine and its current crisis might hold in stock for the future of Europe, including specifically the European Union. Obviously, the profound implications of the war and its the suffering it causes is something that we don't know yet how they're going to end, what repercussions they bring for European society, for our security and integration going forward. Also for universities themselves, this has been quite the time to try and rally our support as best we can. And at UCL, we have tried to create a number of support schemes, including a fellowship scheme, which we run together with the Council of At-Risk Academics in order to support Ukrainian academics displaced by the war. But for tonight's panel, I could really not think of any better constellation of people to guide us through what we might learn from the crisis, what we need to understand from its developments. And I'm really privileged to be introducing the chair, Olesya Khromeychuk, who will be introducing the rest of the speakers. But let me just very briefly refer you to Olesya, who is the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London and an alumna from UCL. She has a PhD in history, which she gained with us. And she is a historian of 20th century East and Central Europe, particularly specializing in Ukrainian history. And she has previously taught at King's, University of East Anglia, Cambridge, as well as at UCL. And she also runs a theatre company, Monnet Theatre in London, that stages documentary pieces that explore very urgent social and political themes. Olesya is originally from Lviv, but moved to the UK in 2000, since when she's been very actively engaged in the life of Ukrainians living in the capital. She's published a range of books, which I encourage you to look up. But for today, I'm just very pleased that you've agreed to join us, Olesya, and I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for introducing me. Thank you for organizing this discussion. Welcome everyone to this panel discussion organized by UCL European Institute and the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. My name is Olesya Khromeychuk and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute. It's an honor for me to chair this discussion today. Just to remind you, this webinar is being recorded. So today we have a really excellent panel of speakers who will consider the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine for the future of European society, European security and integration. And we will hear from all of the speakers to start with, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, a discussion. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A function via Zoom, and we'll try and voice as many of them as we can in the course of the discussion. So let me introduce the panel of speakers in the order that they will speak. We'll start with Andrew Wilson, who is professor in Ukrainian Studies at University College London and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew's book, Ukraine Crisis, What the West Needs to Know, was published by Yale in October 2014. He has worked extensively on the comparative politics of Europe since 1990. His other books include Belarus, The Last European Dictatorship, published in 2011, and The Ukrainians' Unexpected Nation, which was published in 2009 and has been used as a textbook wherever Ukrainian studies are taught all over the world. Next, we'll have Sir David Lidington, who served in the House of Commons for nearly 28 years, including more than 9 years as minister in the governments led by David Cameron and Theresa May. He was Minister for Europe at the Foreign Office, leader of the House of Commons, Justice Secretary, and Minister for the Cabinet Office, in which role he was also deputy to Prime Minister Theresa May. He was a member of the UK's National Security Council and has represented the UK at the EU, NATO, the UN Security Council, and other international gatherings. David is now chair of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. David will be followed by Georgina Wright, who is Senior Fellow and Director of Institute Monnet Europe Program. She is also a Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Senior Fellow at the Center for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey. Before joining Institute Monnet, she was Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government in 2019-2020 and Research Associate at Chatham House between 2014 and 2018. She has also worked for the European Commission and NATO in Brussels. And we'll also hear from Rosa Balfour, who is Director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise include European politics, institutions, and foreign and security policy. And her current research focuses on the relationship between domestic politics and Europe's global role. She has researched and published widely for academia, think tanks, and the international press on issues relating to European politics and international relations, especially on the Mediterranean region, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, EU enlargement, international support for civil society and human rights and democracy. Rosa Balfour is also a member of the Steering Committee of Women in International Security Brussels and an Associate Fellow at LSE Ideas. In 2018 and 2019, she was awarded a fellowship on the Europe's Futures Program at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Since 2021, she is also an honorary patron of the University Association for Contemporary European Studies. So a truly excellent panel for this discussion. And I will begin by asking each of you to offer your reflections on where we are at the moment, on Europe's response to Russia's war in Ukraine, how appropriate or not appropriate in your view it's been, what we've learned from the last 2 months, and also what we've learned from the last 8 years, because of course this war did not begin 2 months ago, it started in 2014. But also if you could maybe perhaps look to the future and offer some reflections on the prospects as you see them. So these are all very broad themes, but you all have very unique expertise, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights. Andrew, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Olesya. Good evening, everybody. Well, in what sense is this a war about Europe? Well, I think we can start by saying clearly not what was on the agenda 6 months ago, NATO enlargement, a European security treaty. I think this is much more clearly now a war about and against Ukraine, a war of open recolonization. I'm very glad I used that term in an article about Crimea a year ago. And denazification. It was very easy to mock when Russia used this absurd term as casus belli in February against a Jewish president who lost a great-grandfather and three of that great-grandfather's brothers in the Holocaust. But I think what's really scary is that within Russian discourse, this term actually makes some sense. Russia is a propaganda state. The way in which that state works is that there is a virtual chorus that reliably chimes the president's key words. So we should very much take seriously Putin's original history essay, now widely known from last year, but also what the chorus has been saying recently. So according to former President Medvedev, Ukraine, mentally transformed into the Third Reich, will suffer its own fate. That was on April the 5th. And there's this now notorious piece on RIA Novosti by Timothy Sergeytsev, What to Do About Ukraine. And I'll quote this at length. A total lustration must be conducted. All organizations involved in Nazi actions must be eliminated and prohibited. The further denazification of the bulk of the population will take the form of re-education through ideological repression of Nazi paradigms. Denazification will inevitably include de-Ukrainianization, the rejection of the large-scale artificial inflation of the ethnic component in the self-identification of the population in historical Malorossiya and Novorossiya territories, meaning those people in the east and south of Ukraine who think they are Ukrainian. Morsegates, Ukrainian is an artificial anti-Russian construct that has no civilizational substance of its own. It is a subordinate element of an extraneous and alien civilization, which is Europe. Yes, sorry. So the collective West is in itself the architect, source, and sponsor of Ukrainian Nazism. Okay, so within this discourse, the meaning of Nazism means identifying as Ukrainian, rejecting the Russian view that Ukrainians don't really exist, and it means being European. A Frasian version of the reality of the term. This has all been gestating for a long time in plain sight on Russian TV for 8 years now. So has what you might call Russian omnigression. Apparently, we are now at war with the whole world, according to Major General Rustam Menakayev. But certainly that means Europe and America. We're not, and that should govern Europe's response. We do have a dilemma in calibrating the need to arm Ukraine, and we've done a lot better in the last 2 weeks in terms of giving Ukraine the bigger and better weaponry than it needs, whilst at the same time not making this kind of crazy fantasy war in Putin's head into a real war, i.e. the Russia versus the West. And I think we are getting that balance better, but we're not saying really why. And the answer, I think, is 4 things to remember from when modern Europe was founded back in the 1950s. Firstly, it was obviously founded on the need to overcome, sublimate war. But back in the 50s, in an environment when we understood that war is a reality and can still be necessary, and most European societies now take for granted the absence of war without understanding the causes and the occasional need to fight wars. Ukraine is very much old Europe, fighting a defensive war, even with some martial pride, which we've long forgotten. Thirdly, less explicitly, in the 50s and 60s, the other thing was supposed to be never again was genocide. And as well as absurd reference to and redefinition of the meaning of Nazi, the kind of propaganda I quoted at the start is openly genocidal. It's talking about removing, re-educating whole populations. Sergeytsev also talks of so-called Catholic Ukraine. He rather loftily says its borders will be decided experimentally. Yeah, something will remain in the west of Ukraine, but it will be, quote, artificially neutral and demilitarized. And that is where all the haters of Russia will go. Though at the moment, the main direction of forced population movement is to Russia. Yeah, 1 million, according to Ukrainian sources, Ukrainians have been removed this kind of forcible re-education already. Fourth thing from the 50s and the 60s is to remember that the EU was founded to bind together former imperial powers in a post-imperial project. Britain, Germany, France, Holland, but never Russia. Russia is the last European empire, and in many ways the most important empire because it was always an empire on the European continent. For sure, it was always a complicated empire with its own unique features. Academics talk of its internal colonization, for example. It never treated its own population particularly well. But from academic post-colonial studies, we apply the principle of it's up to former colonies, the previously subaltern, to define empire as they wish. And to Ukrainians, this is both genocidal and a re-imperialization attempt against them. Though we should also note that Russia benefits from asymmetrical geopolitics. The rest of the world is not behaving in the same way. If it was, Georgia might be attempting a war of reconquest of its home territory right now. Other extremely weak former colonies in Central Asia and elsewhere would be rearming themselves to defend themselves if Russia is not disabled. So this is a war, an existential war of a colony against a former empire. The most dangerous word, I would argue, right now is off-ramp. We hear about that way too much. That implies Russia stops or withdraws, but with forces and threat intact, only until next time. Russia, I would argue, should be defeated in order for Ukraine to survive and Europe to revisit the agenda that founded the EU in the 1950s. Unfortunately, we still tend to think in extremely bureaucratic terms. Ukraine, along with Georgia and Moldova, have applied for formal membership. Probably, sadly and inevitably, that will be met with the usual EU talk about the Copenhagen criteria, sort of kicking that can down the road. But in terms of the existential reasons why Europe was founded way back in the 50s, there should be an open door for Ukraine.
Thank you, Andrew. We will move on to David straight away, and we'll take some questions later.
Thank you very much indeed, Olesya. Well, I very much agreed with pretty much everything that Andrew said in his analysis, but let me add a few thoughts of my own. I think looking at where we are today, I'm very clear about what the objective of democratic Europe and of the Atlantic Alliance as a whole should be, and that is that Russia must lose. I think anything less from that will be a defeat, a strategic defeat for the democratic world. Putin is testing and will continue to test until he suffers a reverse and a defeat. Certainly, Andrew was right in attributing this most recent act of aggression by Russia to sort of dreams of reconstructing its empire. I mean, this frankly racist nonsense about Ukraine not being a proper nation in its own right indicates, I think, the state of mind of some of the people at the top of the Kremlin, and particularly Putin himself. The complaint that this is really all provoked by the expansion of NATO is demonstrably untrue, given that the NATO-Russia Founding Act recognized the bound parties to accept the borders of Europe as they existed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Russia accepted a treaty obligation under the Budapest Memorandum to respect the independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And of course, its invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk in that year happened at a time when Ukraine was a neutral state before the constitutional aspiration to join NATO had been devised. We are now also seeing the mass transportation, there's no other word for it, of Ukrainian citizens from Russian occupied areas to places in what I think is best described as a 21st century version of the Gulag. So I don't think that there is any option for us than to continue with the hard line that all of the democratic allies have adopted. I don't see that for the foreseeable future there is any prospect of a compromise becoming available which is acceptable to both Putin and to President Zelensky. Putin, I don't think, can concede a return to the line of contact before his aggression of earlier this year. And I don't think that after revelation of the atrocities that have taken place in different parts of Ukraine during this war, that President Zelensky can accept, or that his people would allow him to accept any outcome which in effect accepted the continued occupation by Russia of Ukrainian territory, and therefore leaving fellow citizens of Ukraine victims to this sustained sort of persecution and tyranny that Putin is imposing upon those areas where he has seized control already. So I am deeply gloomy about the immediate prospects, even if Putin were to make some advances in the Donbass and then hold a pause and declare some kind of victory. I do not for a moment believe that that would be stable. I think that there will be an expectation in Kiev that the West will continue to arm Ukraine. There would be a resistance that the Ukrainian government would promote within the occupied territories, and I think the Russians would only see such an outcome as a temporary measure before they sought the Kremlin's real ambition of trying to reassert effective control over the whole of Ukrainian territory, turn the whole of Ukraine into a sort of vassal state in the way that they have succeeded with Belarus. Now, I think that in Putin's mind, it seems to me that he believes he can outlast the patience of the West. He believes, I think correctly, given history of the last century, that the Russian people have a very high pain threshold. And he is, of course, using his control of the media to try to foster support for his own perverted vision of the causes of this conflict. He believes that the West will lack the patience, will not persevere with either the solidarity or the practical measures that Western allies have taken. And if you look at what happened after 2008, of the invasion of Georgia, and 2014, after the last incursion and occupation of parts of Ukraine, you could understand why Putin believes that. He will look to exploit any differences he can spot between Western allies. He will hope for President Trump to be re-elected in 2024 and hope that that might shift US policy. He will look to make trouble elsewhere. Moldova strikes me as particularly vulnerable at the moment, but possibly Georgia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Russians have been supporting Dodik's push to weaken the Bosnia-Herzegovina central state institutions, perhaps even in other parts of the Western Balkans as well. And we cannot rule out that Russia will use chemical, radiological, or tactical nuclear weapons as part of this conflict. The use of tactical nuclear weapons is openly provided for in Russian military doctrine, and chemical weapons we have seen used by Putin's dependent Assad in Syria, and of course we have had in the UK both a radiological attack with the murder of Alexander Litvinenko and a chemical weapons attack taking place in Salisbury only a few years back, leading to the death of a completely innocent British citizen there. Now, what are the lessons for the West? And what have we learned from our experience of the last few weeks? First of all, I think that Washington has realized, if it had been in any doubt, that European security still matters, and European security and peace cannot simply be left for granted. And I think that the European allies have realized that United States leadership remains critically important to the security of our continent. I think that we have seen greater determination and solidarity within NATO than at any time in recent years. And a lot of the criticisms of NATO have been silenced, I think, in the last few weeks. At the same time, we've seen better EU-NATO relations with the EU institutional leaders and Secretary General Stoltenberg meeting and talking frequently. We've seen a dramatic shift in German policy, and we might go on later to consider whether there's a gap between the promise and the delivery so far. But there's no doubt in my mind Chancellor Scholz's speech to the Bundestag was epoch-making in how it ditched decades of assumptions about Germany's defence and foreign policy posture, and the assumptions of the Chancellor's own political party in particular. We have Sweden and Finland now likely to join NATO within weeks or months. We have the Irish Foreign Minister publicly questioning what Irish neutrality actually means in today's Europe. We have the United Kingdom post-Brexit, demonstrably still a serious player in European security, and Boris Johnson having to talk to Macron, Scholz, von der Leyen and others, and they having to talk to him much more frequently and intensively than at any time since he took office, and certainly since Brexit happened, which I believe is an essential sort of precondition for trying to rebuild a relationship of trust, which I think the security of Europe as a whole desperately needs. And that, of course, is on top of the work that's been going on between the UK and the other members of the Joint Expeditionary Force. So what now? First of all, I don't expect there to be a deliberate direct conflict between NATO and Russia unless Putin oversteps the mark and tries to test the will of NATO by entering or striking at NATO territory directly and deliberately. I've been struck by President Biden's comments that whenever he has talked about the United States not getting involved in fighting Russia within Ukraine, he has coupled that with saying that the United States will, of course, defend every square inch of NATO territory. And I think that's a very clear message of hands-off places like eastern Latvia or parts of Estonia that might otherwise be at risk. Secondly, I think that all of us in democratic Europe need to continue to deliver arms, material and training to the Ukrainian forces to enable them to resist as best they can. And I think that we can develop further the mechanisms for cooperation between European countries to make sure that we are as effective together as we possibly can be. Third, I think we're going to need to continue with the sanctions, and I think those sanctions are going to have to continue indefinitely. And if Russia were to use chemical, radiological, or nuclear weapons, then I certainly would expect and hope for the West's reactions to be to strengthen those sanctions still further. There are still missing elements, as we all know. Not every Russian bank or financial institution has been excluded from SWIFT for reasons we understand. There's a reluctance to accelerate the European dependence upon Russian energy supplies. I mean, it's good that there's a plan to phase it out, and I completely understand why it is very difficult for some countries to do that quickly. But I think if Russia were to use weapons of mass destruction, I think that would change the picture. And I think we need to continue to collect evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. What may, of course, happen is if there were a Russian resort to chemical or particularly tactical nuclear weapons, is the United States might consider using secondary sanctions of the kind that it has deployed against Iran, forcing companies in effect choose between their interests in Russia and their interests in operating and trading within United States jurisdiction. And that would probably bring about the almost complete isolation of the Russian economy from the Western world. And I do think that that is something that Biden will come under very acute pressure to do from Republicans and Democrats alike, were Russia to cross that particular threshold. But I think in the long run, we in the West have to be prepared psychologically for a prolonged second Cold War. I simply do not believe, after what has now happened, and in particular after the mass slaughter of civilians, that we can contemplate a return to normal, to anything like the status quo ante, as long as Vladimir Putin or a disciple of his is in power in the Kremlin. And that is unwelcome. We all had different and better hopes for the relationship with Russia, but I frankly do not see those hopes as plausible after what has happened in the last 6 weeks. Finally, on European security, I think that there are two tasks. The first is to keep persuading the people of the United States and their representatives that European security matters to the US, that it should be considered a core national interest of the American people. I mean, we criticize President Trump, and I certainly criticized President Trump in the past, but the thing about Trump is he does and did represent a significant strand of US public opinion that felt that for far too long European countries had been freeloading on the back of the American taxpayer. And I think that we're going to need to demonstrate in the future that we as European allies are both paying our fair share, but also exercising greater political leadership, particularly in those parts of the world which the United States will not consider core priorities. So certainly parts of Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, Africa, some Middle Eastern countries. I think Europe is going to have to step up and take the lead more, and that's something that we've seen a shift in expectations in the United States, certainly since President Obama's time, which has been continued by both Trump and by President Biden. And that leads me finally to what new structures do we need for European security post-Brexit? I've never believed that you can talk sensibly about a European pillar of the Atlantic Alliance or a European security capability unless you have both France and the United Kingdom involved. I hope that Germany is going to fully accept its responsibilities as a major European power by showing a more forward-leaning policy on security, and I think that is something that we shall have to see as time goes on. But we have to deal with this in a context where some countries in democratic Europe will be in the European Union, some will be outside, some will be in NATO, some will be outside, where we somehow need to find a place, a European offer to Moldova, to, I hope, a free Ukraine, to the Western Balkans countries, at a time when the EU electorates and EU governments are pretty much exhausted with the idea of further enlargement. Does this, for example, take us back to some of the ideas that President Macron has voted in the past about a Europe of circles, or about a European Security Council that would enable European allies to act, perhaps drawing on NATO and or EU resources, at a time when there was a security challenge that was outside the NATO remit, or where the United States decided that it did not wish to become involved or take a leadership role. So I think major challenges for us in the future, but I hope that if there's any sort of thin reassurance to be taken from this horrendous crisis and now humanitarian catastrophe as well, that it will mean that European democracies become aware that we cannot take our way of life, our values, our peace for granted, and that we show the resolution that we did for most of the post-war period in defending those values and that security in the interest of our citizens, including the citizens of those developing democracies in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, who are not looking to Russia for their model, but are looking rather in our direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So we can now move on to Georgina.
Thank you, Olesya, and thank you to UCL European Institute and SSEES for the invitation. It's lovely to be back in the UK virtually, if from Paris. Of course, the problem going after Andrew and Sir David is that they've perfectly, set out the problems, how Russia sees things, and then of course Sir David with numerous proposals. So it's all the best things have been said. So I'm going to sort of rejig my presentation slightly and focus instead on France more specifically, because as most people on this call will be aware, Emmanuel Macron has been re-elected, and this will have implications, I think, on what France does next on the war in Ukraine. So I think it's quite important to remind ourselves what France's approach was prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And I think it rested on four pillars. One was dissuasion, so through sanctions. There was really this sense that sanctions would deter Russia from invading. The second was public support for ongoing dialogue, so Russia-US talks. Gosh, those seem ages ago, but they were happening. The talks within the OSCE, talks within NATO, and of course support to any bilateral visits to Kiev and to Moscow. The third was political and military support to Ukraine. And the fourth was reinforce NATO's presence. So there was this promise to have more French troops in Romania, for example, but also talk about EU defense. So what has changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Well, the sanctions are now no longer to deter, but very much to punish Russia. And of course, there is a realization that these sanctions don't go far enough and that they haven't been sufficient. And I suspect Rosa is going to touch on this, but I think we've seen incredible EU unity on sanctions, but it's going to be tested now because the decisions of what future sanction package and what future sanctions can look like, as Sir David highlighted, it's tricky, and it's going to impact some member states more than others. But sanctions to punish, to support ongoing dialogue, including of course Emmanuel Macron's talks with Vladimir Putin, and that's something that the French society as a whole supports. So they see the French president's ongoing talks with Vladimir Putin is important. The third is political military support to Ukraine, yes, but also humanitarian and financial assistance. And finally, much more active within NATO and on EU defence. And I think there was, in Paris at the time, we heard the sense of somber determination, which, in typical sort of French drama, but I think kind of really captures the mood around the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was this realization that we can't act without US leadership, and that commercial tools or trade tools aren't enough to exert pressure. And that actually, we need much more to deter Russia and also to respond to Russian aggression. And then there was this realization that France got its initial reading wrong. I mean, if you remember when the US and the UK were saying, we think a Russian invasion is imminent and poses a great threat, Germany and France said, well, we don't have the same intelligence. And so there was this open public acknowledgement that they got their reading wrong. So this somber determination led to what we're calling a geopolitical awakening for the EU, which of course France under Macron supports. The realization that the EU needed to be in a position to act, or Europe needed to be in a position to act. So there's NATO, but also the EU filling the gaps. So on investment in particular, we can come back to that in the Q&A if that's helpful. The realization that the EU, where it could act, acted really forcefully. So on sanctions, for example, though, again, as I said before, the realization that the unity on sanctions might be tested now. And also thirdly, I think, which sometimes goes, we take it for granted, but actually the EU unity can work. And you hear in Paris a lot of times the three big moments of EU unity. So on COVID, with the response, particularly in the form of this mass investment plan, on Brexit, and now on Ukraine. And the question is, will they be able to continue that? And of course, beyond the EU's response, which France supports, France has also given 420 million euros to in humanitarian and military assistance to Ukraine. And the 420, there's 100 million in the form of military weaponry, so missiles and cannons. So what has France's reaction been beyond the kind of support? So as I said, initial skepticism that Russia would actually invade, but all of the candidates who were running in the election did condemn Russia's invasion. Though not all of them have supported Macron's response. And this is where it's quite interesting. So if you look at Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's the hard left candidate, and Marine Le Pen, who was the far right, one of the far right candidates, they said, of course, Marine Le Pen put it quite interestingly. She said, of course, I support unconditionally Ukraine because I believe in sovereignty, but I also don't believe in the delivery of arms to Ukraine. Though in the grand débat, so that debate where she faced Emmanuel Macron, she did actually reverse that and said, no, I do believe in military support to Ukraine. And most, I think, French people are against any further enlargement, which also could be a problem if we do consider, think about Ukraine ever joining the EU and sort of the blocks there. Well, the councils, the grouping of the EU 20, the 27 member states would have to unanimously agree to accession, but it also might go to a referendum in France. And at the moment, the French are not really in favour of further enlargement. But the question then is, what's the alternative? And that's where this idea of concentric circles and other forms of association, I think, will be explored, especially now that we know who's going to be in the Elysee for the next 5 years. So finally, what next? I think France will obviously continue to fully support the EU and continue to be active in NATO. And I suspect, actually, that France will one day, we hear more and more this discussions of the European pillar of NATO, and I suspect France will want to be at the heart of those discussions. You can expect a lot more on EU defence, but when you look at what that means in practice, still big disagreements there. And so at the moment, we're still at the rhetoric, but I suspect France will push to go further and faster on that as well. And finally, on sanctions, I mean, the French president always visits the German chancellor. That's always his first state visit once they are elected. And I think further sanctions, and particularly how to stop imports of Russian fossil fuels, will be high on their agenda. And then, you know, who knows, potentially a joint visit to Kiev to show support to the Ukrainians. But there are many more things we can go into, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Georgina. So Rosa, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be in this group. I'm actually in London at the moment, not in Brussels, but I will be speaking with a view from Brussels, because I think a lot has been said. I agree with most of what has been said already, so I'll try to sort of give the view from the EU in the hope to add a little bit more analysis. But what I'd like to do, Olesya, is actually start from a question that you asked at the very beginning. To what extent was the conflict foreseeable? And you tied it obviously to the annexation of Crimea 2014. And I would say, let's start with Georgia 2008. And I think in most European capitals, the realization that 2008, 2014, and 2022 are actually an escalation of the same goal. I think this, Russia's goal, I think that realization did not come before the 24th of February. And Georgina rightly pointed out to French and German intelligence as to what Russia was doing. I mean, there was incredulity in these European capitals that it was actually Putin's goal. And so I think, in light of this, we need to understand the response also in light of this cloudy view of Putin's intentions prior to the 24th of February 2022. And so the response was a dramatic shift, as Sir David was saying earlier. And I think the question really is to what extent this shift will last and how deep it will go. Georgina rightly pointed out to the French presidential elections. Macron won, but of course many voted for Marine Le Pen, whose policy on Russia is incompatible with the West's policy towards Russia at the moment. We will have elections in Italy in 1 year's time, roundabout, and there are pockets, still pockets of public opinion that view the current war very much through Russian lens. And this is playing out also in Germany at the moment, and it's playing out in the SPD, in the party of the Chancellor. And so even though we have seen an unprecedented united response, it still is something that I think needs to be measured against time and the degree to which this response will hold. And it is on the lives of Ukrainians that this will play out, essentially. If Russia were to, which it appears not in its present intention, to halt and negotiate some kind of deal with Ukraine, and this really is very unlikely at this moment in time for both sides. I think in Europe there would be a lot of opinion in favor of some kind of ceasefire, which would not solve the problem if we accept that Putin's goal is actually to destroy Ukraine and to upend European security. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 situation from this point of view, and it's being played out on the lives of Ukrainians. So in the European context, the degree to which domestic politics will shape foreign policy is still important, and we need to watch that space precisely because of these pockets and the electoral cycles, etc. Having said all this, the response has been remarkable and unprecedented, and it's a whole set of package. And I'll just list the areas rather than go into any depth. I don't think we need to in this context, but we We've had 5 packages of sanctions, which have been carefully crafted and prepared with the support of the Americans as well, unprecedented transatlantic cooperation on this front, and of course also with the UK at last. They started talking again, the UK and the EU, on foreign policy matters. Commitments on security and defense, budgets, spending plans, also in supporting Ukraine. Not all member states are doing, not all EU member states are doing it, but some are doing this. Unprecedented solidarity with Ukrainian refugees. Alas, it is just the Ukrainian refugees. It doesn't really change the, doesn't necessarily change the refugee policy, and doesn't necessarily alter the problems that the EU had back in 2015, 2016, when it was Syrian and Afghan refugees, but nonetheless, this is happening. Extraordinary economic and financial support to Ukraine. And of course, perhaps the most significant and far-reaching response with respect to energy diversification. This will have a long-term impact in weaning Europe off Russian fossil fuels, and potentially, if it's played out well, also at accelerating the green energy transition. So the responses are, massive, massive, wide, unprecedented, and negotiated together with the closest partners of Europe, the US, the UK, etc. And I think they do reveal quite an extraordinary might in terms of economic statecraft. And this is something which I think will remain for the long term. This is where Europe's strengths actually are. And this is where Europe will profit some lessons and benefit from what it has managed to mobilize. The other thing I'd like to refer to is the enlargement question. This has been, in fact, all speakers have referred to it. I think it's critical that Europe, the EU, European member states respond very positively to this demand for accession, especially given that Ukraine itself has, been willing to rule out NATO membership, which is what it had aspired to until very recently. The type of response, this will be tricky, as Georgina was mentioning, but I do think, as Sir David was also saying, it does add new arguments in favor of Macron's proposal for, be it a differentiated, a sort of wider European Union with different types of association. There's several ideas circulating on this front, and I would be, so long as the war longer the war continues, I think the more these ideas will continue circulating, and the more compelling they will become. It will be harder for European capitals to keep these countries out. But we do have, the starting point has to be in June with North Macedonia and Albania, which need to get green lights towards starting negotiating accession with the EU. But I think not now, not with the present commissioner, but perhaps in the next commission with a new commissioner working on enlargement and what is now called enlargement and neighborhood policy. There'll be ways to be creative so that we can associate the 3 countries that have just applied, that are just in the process of submitting their applications, more creative ways to keep them engaged and to keep that dialogue moving. So that is critical. Is all this enough? I think this is another question, Olesya, that you raised. Is all this enough? And I think what's interesting is that only yesterday, or in today's news, did we actually get an idea of what the end goal of the West actually is. This had not been clear because nobody wants to talk about regime change. Nobody wants to even mention the word. And if Putin or Russians thought that the West was aiming for regime change, it would have been highly detrimental to the West's policy. So this has been brushed under the carpet. This is not what the West is about. But finally, yesterday, following the visit of Blinken to Ukraine, it was clear, and I think this is a very it's a clear objective that can be shared by European governments as well. The goal is to make sure that Russia will not be able to militarily attack again further. And so whether it is Donbass, or whether it is just Donetsk and Luhansk, whether it is Crimea or not, that is down to Ukrainians, to be perfectly honest, to say what it is they're willing to accept and what not. But the key point is that it has to end there, because what we've seen 2004, 2014, 2022 has just been an expansion of those goals. It's, the times in between need to be interpreted as timing for preparation, not as, Putin suddenly woke up one day and decided that he actually quite fancied the Donbass. So the goal has to be to make sure that Russia is no longer capable of attacking Ukraine, Moldova, or anywhere else for that matter. And that is a military goal, but it's also a goal that can be achieved through the sanctions. And I think there still is room for a further sanctions package, which is being discussed. It was put on hold somewhat, but now it's likely to be rediscussed here in Brussels on an oil embargo. There's the problem of Germany, and Germany doesn't, and German Chancellor doesn't seem to be preparing the German public towards bearing the costs of an oil embargo, but it's being discussed. And sanctions are not just, at this point, they should not just be interpreted as punitive tools or as tools to signal the West's disagreement with Russian actions in Ukraine. They need to be interpreted as undermining the capacity of the of the regime to attack further beyond, outside its borders. And I think this is important to clarify that this is the end goal. And then in parallel, just going back, and here, I refer really to work of my colleagues and the work of other authors who are experts on Russia. It's going to be very difficult to engage with Russia even after Putin. It's going to be increased. It's becoming, the more the war is prolonged, the more tensions, the confrontation rises, the harder it is. And we need to prepare for a Russia that could implode. We need to, at the moment, the goal of the regime is to turn it clearly into a totalitarian state. At least this is what my colleagues from Carnegie Russia are writing. And there is a risk that Russia might implode, and we don't know along what lines, but the possibility of a sort of democratization of Russia, which has been really the sort of idea at the back of the minds of the West since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, since the end of the Cold War, this seems to be quite remote. So, alongside being clear about what the aims of West's policy, what the aims are, I think we also need to think about what to do with post-Putin Russia and how to engage with Russians, and not least Ukrainian-Russian reconciliation, which is, I mean, I realize I'm being a bit futuristic here. It's very hard to imagine these days, but eventually it'll have to be, I think it will have to be addressed. I'll end here for now. There's plenty more I could say, but I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm sure you're all also, dying to respond to each other, but we only have half an hour and we have a lot of questions, and I will refer to those questions both submitted before the event and what we've received in Q&A function now. But I will just begin with one question that I am really curious to hear from you an answer to, and that's, you've mentioned, I think most of you have mentioned that there was no clear realization of what Putin's actual end goals were until 2 months ago. Not necessarily in Ukraine, I would say. I mean, I think it was pretty clear for Ukrainians since 2014 that the destruction of statehood in one form or another was definitely an aim of Putin's Russia. And we've also seen skepticism in Europe in relation to how long Ukrainians can last once Russia did attack, something between 3 hours and 3 days, right? And we've been proved wrong. And the sort of the other branch of this skepticism was this absolute surprise, defiance and resilience that Ukrainians have shown, which I think is also a sign of ignorance of Europe, not realizing that, of course, Ukrainians will stand up defiant because they know exactly what Russian occupation means, because they've experienced it for 8 years in Crimea and parts of Donbass, and therefore they will not be prepared to experience it anywhere else in Ukraine. So really, Ukrainians have found themselves in this kind of curse of Cassandra, of knowing the future but not being listened to. I suppose the question I'm asking you is Europe and the collective West listening to the knowledge coming out of Ukraine now for in a more meaningful way than it did before? And as David said, that European security is it needs to be made more clear that European security is not national interest of the American people. Well, what about the realization of Europeans and Brits, I include in the European community, whether they understand that Ukrainian security is part of national interests for Western Europeans? So this is a kind of twofold question, but it's really related to the same issues. It's to all of you, so please do choose who would like to answer it. Just unmute yourselves, please. I can see that. Yeah, Andrew, please.
Well, there was also a question in the chat about why there were no Ukrainian experts on the panel. I've been channeling some of them, both in my initial remarks and in other events. But I definitely think the West doesn't listen enough, although Ukrainians have done a much better job at explaining their positions highly articulately and in much better English than was the case 10, 20 years ago. But there is West-splaining, and there is still a failure to recognize Ukrainian subjectivity and to put overall Western interests in front of Ukraine's. Still talked about the dangers of being dragged into further war. For Germany openly to say that a 2% hit to its GDP is not worth paying. And also to, although recognize the fighting capacity of the Ukrainian army, still not give it proper credit. This is hugely and mainly morale. The importance of fighting for your own country and not fighting for distorted propaganda, unreality. But it's also horizontal help to the army, civil society support, better leadership, not just Zelensky, but the army has been much better led than Russia's. And I don't think we recognize that still. We still keep expecting Ukraine to collapse under heavy Russian onslaught. Russia keeps showing its inferior morale and military organization at every step. The whole point of the recent Donbass offensive was to try and disguise that, minimize casualties, prioritize artillery, and keep really bad Russian troops away from the front line. But they've still run into many of the same problems. Unfortunately, it has the paradox of tempting Putin towards these chemical and other weapons, precisely because his conventional forces perform so well. So I don't think we've done well enough in terms of giving Ukraine proper voice, in terms of putting their voice at the top of the agenda, and of even properly analysing what's happening on the ground.
Thank you, Andrew.
So I come in, Olesya, and I think in terms of, looking back, what did we collectively get wrong about this? I think there's probably was an assumption that Russia would be guided by a sort of rational self-interest, and that as long as Ukraine was fairly weak, divided, a lot of sort of corrupt oligarch influence on the politics of Ukraine, and that there was an unresolved conflict in the east that meant that, frankly, Russia knew NATO and EU membership was not actually going to happen for many, many years, if at all, because until that conflict had been sorted out, one wouldn't know the territory that one was giving membership to and support to. But then I think things have changed. I think that part of it may be Putin personally. There's everybody who's been watching him and watching Russia closely says that, he spent the last 2 years pretty much in isolation from anybody else. He seems genuinely to believe these fantasies that Ukrainians, particularly Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are Russians really, and are just longing to return to the Russian family. I think Zelensky demonstrated that he was not willing to be a Russian patsy, and I think that possibly came as something of a shock to the Kremlin. And then they looked at the state of the West. They saw a chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and certainly a strategic defeat for the West. They've seen Brexit, and I had my very strong views, but basically a continuing quarrel and friction between London and key EU members. We've seen President Macron in a difficult re-election battle. They've seen a new, untested German coalition coming into office. So the West was looking pretty febrile. And I think if you're Putin, you look back at 2008 and 2014, I think one could say that the sanctions packages then were not strong enough, but also that they were relaxed far too soon. I can remember sitting in the Foreign Affairs Council, as soon after the annexation of Crimea as 2015, and having some of my colleagues around the table arguing that the sanctions should not be fully renewed when they came up for their 12-monthly reassessment and renewal, and they should be diluted in some way. And I say that was within a year of Crimea being annexed. So I think that, and I think this aggression has been a real wake-up call to the West. I just hope that those lessons are learned and sustained.
Thank you. Anyone else? Rosa.
Yeah, very quickly. Yes, no, I do think the understanding of Ukrainian history is limited in much of Europe. And I think also there are quite a few, again, pockets, but not uninfluential pockets who actually think Ukraine doesn't exist historically as a nation, as a people. So there's a lot more explaining that needs to be done. But I also think that it should not just be on the basis of fraternal solidarity that Europe should mobilize. There's also the principle that you cannot invade a country or do land grabs or undermine the sovereignty of another country. And that's what the whole post-World War II order was built upon. And so it's not just that we need to mobilize because Ukraine is European, but it's because Russia has broken certain fundamental norms that are required for peaceful order. And so there are two reasons, but what I'm not seeing necessarily everywhere, the same sort of mobilization, rhetorical mobilization in favor both of Ukrainians and of principles on part of our governments. And that's why I was voicing some words of caution earlier when I was talking about, how long will Europeans endure, especially if you have a chancellor who's, worried about the impact of an oil embargo on the country's GDP. This is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So, maybe it's a price that is worth paying.
Thank you. Andrew, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Oh, there are plenty of other questions, but when David Lidington was talking about things we got wrong, I think there's one thing that we got right, even spectacularly right, which is a totally different approach to Russian myth-making and disinformation. I think there are many reasons why we released such high quality intelligence, but foremost amongst them was a strategy to prevent Russia creating a cover story, a narrative for its invasion, by putting all of our information out in the public arena. And I think that worked very, very well. I mean, the main thing that undermined any Russian cover story was invasion. It's very difficult to construct another narrative once that happened. This kind of unprecedented release of high quality intelligence helped as well.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the questions, hoping to cover at least some of them. So you've all mentioned the EU integration and expansion, and also the perhaps surprising to at least Putin unity to some degree, although there's still difference of opinion. There's a really good question which is asking whether the EU has to undergo a deep rethinking of itself, its values, and perhaps even restructuring. And will it not cease to be attractive to many participating countries otherwise? So, you know, we're prepared to assume again that most of the countries that wanted to join still do want to join, but of course let's not forget that joke that appeared in Ukraine about NATO, that, you know, NATO can apply to join Ukraine after a couple of weeks of Ukrainian resistance. So yeah, anybody wants to take that? Maybe Georgina, you would like to start?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, that would be kind of preaching to Macron, because he would love that question, and he would respond by saying, well, for the past 5 years, that's what I've been saying, right? I've been saying we need to reform the EU because it doesn't meet the expectations, nor is it responding to the concerns of French and European citizens, and we need to reform it, and we need to reform it on all sorts of things. And then he'll kind of roll out the 60 proposals he set out in his Sorbonne speech. So, I mean, that is, you know, in Paris, they would really agree with that. But I think the question, so I'm turning it in jest, which I shouldn't, because obviously this is a, you know, this is a really serious situation. And I think this is a really good question, because beyond the rhetoric, what does that mean in practice? And that's where sometimes Macron, you know, gets under other EU leaders' skin, which is, it's great to put forward all these proposals, but we need to make sure that there is a, you know, sufficient deliberation, and that actually these reforms are going to be supported by our publics, because a lot of them, if you look at, even there was this, you know, conference on the future of Europe, which some people may have heard of now. It wasn't the grand democratic exercise that Macron was hoping for, but they had sort of, I think, 400 to, no, maybe more like 200,000 people participate. So it's like, you know, nowhere near the 400 plus million Europeans, but who pitched in proposals for the future of the EU. And actually, if you look at many of them, even those who say, I want, you know, I don't want the EU, I don't want institutions determining what happens in my country. If you look at their proposals, the answer really lies in more Europe, often, not less. But it's not because the solution is more Europe that it will be readily accepted. And so I think, and this is where the question is interesting, is yes, the EU needs to reform, it needs to reform on all sorts of fronts, but do we have public buy-in and support for those reforms? And that's much harder to achieve. And I think, in a sense, the EU knows it has to change, because otherwise it will potentially lose even more support, and, you know, who knows, potentially lead to further weakening and fragmentation in the long term. And I think that political buy-in is going to be essential.
Great, thank you. Another question from a member of the audience. I'm quoting it as: no longer a secret that European and Russian business politics and charity are closely connected with each other by Russian money. In your opinion, what role did the corruption of European politicians, hidden or more obvious, and private interests play in allowing the situation to happen? Can Europe do something about this now, or is it fraught with internal instability? David, may I ask you to comment? We've heard the nickname of London Grad many times.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are criticisms that could be made of that. But I think that there's no evidence that I've seen that suggests that there's been a practical impact on policy. I mean, Russia, Putin have certainly tried to influence the UK, and we know that there have been Russian bots and other disinformation exercises, RTs being used as a propaganda channel. But our rules on political funding are pretty strict, and that it's simply unlawful to accept a donation from a foreign national, except a sort of Irish or Commonwealth resident in the country, eligible to vote in the UK. So, the idea that Russia can simply sort of influence British policy, I generally don't think, having been in cabinet, having been in government for nearly 10 years, I just didn't see that happening at all. They never bothered with me anyway. And our Independent Electoral Commission said that they found no evidence of that in general elections or in the Brexit referendum. A lot of allegations, and as somebody who strongly supported Remain, I might have been the first one to sort of demand a recount in those circumstances, but you can't put down sort of millions of people voting with a pencil in a polling booth and say that that's due to Russian propaganda or Russian money. So yeah, we've got to be on our guard against it, and we probably should have been more on our guard in the past than we have been. I mean, Cameron made an effort when he had the presidency of the G7 to get sort of global agreement on this, so one would deal not only with the various sort of UK British Overseas Territory tax shelters, but with the state of Delaware, with some of the arrangements in other parts of Europe as well. And I still think, in practical deliverable terms, that is probably the most effective way to go about this. But we all have to learn from this experience.
Thank you. Anyone else wishes to comment on that? No, Andrew?
Well, I just list several French companies that Macron will have to ask questions about in his second term. Total, obviously, in energy, but most importantly, excuse my French, Thales, who have been supplying the Russian military, including thermal imaging used in various war crimes. That will be an ongoing scandal.
Great, thank you. Another question from an audience member submitted before this discussion, and it goes as follows: can Ukraine combine a possible future neutral status with sufficient military capacity to deter further Russian aggression? So Ukrainian neutrality is being discussed and has been discussed for some time. And Yaroslav Hrycak, Ukrainian historian, recently gave an interview which I thought was very compelling, where he says that most countries do not choose to be neutral. The circumstances force them to be neutral, and when they have a chance not to be, they won't be. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Andrew, maybe you could start again.
Okay. There are many types of neutrality, and Ukraine has zero interest in Russia's proposed non-bloc, non-military form of neutrality. That's an absolute non-starter in the current circumstances. There are forms of heavily armed neutrality where neutrality is guaranteed by other states. That was why we technically went to war in 1914 over Belgium, because we guaranteed its neutrality. If forms of security assurance can be allied to neutrality or some kind of highly militarized but regionally supported non-bloc or new bloc kind of status, there's plenty of room for creative thinking there. But the forms of guarantee that Ukraine is talking about almost amount to Article 5 kind of strength. In which case, why not join NATO? That is the most difficult part in that kind of creative thinking, getting close to Article 5 without actually being in NATO.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are obvious challenges about the sort of security guarantees, but not NATO membership that Zelensky has been talking about. I mean, frankly, I cannot see that European security guarantees would be sufficient for Ukraine. Even if both the European nuclear powers were part of that, I think probably unless the US were willing to act as a guarantor for Ukraine, and that again also raises questions about stationing of forces, tripwire arrangements, and so on, then I can't see the UK and France on their own or with other European partners being sufficient there. It's one of the reasons why I'm just pessimistic about the idea that there's some compromise, which only if we look hard enough we can identify. I mean, actually, worth just saying, if I may, Olesya, in passing, just I think one of the consequences of this crisis is that nuclear proliferation globally is now more likely, because I think a lot of countries are going to look at what's happened to Ukraine and say that's what happens when you choose to give up your nuclear weapons. So I think that's another really bad outcome of this crisis.
Indeed.
Can I quickly add, Olesya, because I think David's absolutely right, and I hope that this gives France and the UK, one area where they could come together and think constructively about nuclear proliferation and all the rest of it. But I also think it's about nuclear power, and we know that France and Germany see things very differently, but nuclear plants being so vital in French energy provision. So I think it extends, it's beyond the simple kind of defense, nuclear weapons. It's also about nuclear energy. And I think that's going to be a key debate as well.
Thank you. Another question, I'll try and slip in another 2 questions, hopefully we'll be able to answer in the remaining time. So a question from a member of the audience: what do you consider the likelihood of significant civil and social unrest and even war in Western Balkans? And can Serbia really be considered as a potential EU member in view of its stance on Russia? We haven't heard from Rosa for a while. Rosa, would you like to start?
Yeah, no, I mean, this responds very much to something I've been thinking about we've just had presidential elections in France and Macron was re-elected. So one risk has been postponed to 5 years' time. But on 3rd of April, both Viktor Orban and Vučić were re-elected respectively in Hungary and in Serbia, and they both are quite openly pro-Russian. And one is, of course, a member of the European Union and causes a lot of trouble in undermining unity among the EU member states, less so within NATO, but definitely in Brussels, in the EU. Regularly undermines unity, tries to block even banal declarations are blocked by Hungary. And of course, Serbia is in accession talks to join the EU, very far from joining, and we know the enlargement process has been in a long period of crisis and stalemate. But nonetheless, Vučić has, once re-elected, has confirmed that they're not going to follow EU policy, despite the fact that if you're a candidate country, you're supposed to align your foreign policy positions to those of the EU. And so it's got me wondering as to, in this sort of post Russian invasion of Ukraine world, whether the EU can actually continue having such disruptive elements within, and whether we should start thinking about a foreign policy of fewer, because there's a debate on qualified majority voting, which I think is very institutional, and it's not going to solve the problem. I think the problem is how to circumvent member states that continuously ostracize and common positions when clearly the European interest is there. I mean, in this case, there's no doubt about where the European interest is. So yes, so that is a problem. I mean, both, of course, Vučić and Orban have consolidated their positions in power. The opposition to these political forces have not managed to vote them out democratically. So this is a problem, and it's a problem that runs parallel to the erosion of democracy in both these countries. So we need to see it also, and Europe's strength has to be tied to its democratic strength. So this is a challenge. This is a big problem. I won't give answers now, but it's a big problem and something that needs to be monitored carefully.
Thank you. And I'd like to end by taking us beyond Europe, because of course Russia's war in Ukraine has implications for the entire world, and well, in particular with food shortages that we're likely to experience and already beginning to experience. And one of the questions that was submitted beforehand was, how can we get more support from China, India, and other countries against this war? And I'm afraid we need very brief answers, because we do need to wrap up. Brief answers to a very complicated question.
I'll have a go and give a highly insufficient answer, which is it's going to be very difficult. I don't think, China prides itself on not being aligned on things. And so taking a position in this, it will be very difficult to get, to make China budge. And the Lidington, where I work, they published a really interesting brief looking at how Chinese media was covering the war in Ukraine. And most of it was sort of initial surprise that Russia hadn't managed, how could their military get it so wrong? But there was this real sense of not taking a position, continuing to emphasize diplomacy, but it's not our role to have a say, and also trying to see it from both angles. So I think it's going to be very difficult, and equally with India. So I wish I had a solution. I wish I could say, oh, well, talks, let's just continue talking. But I've become a little bit skeptical and slightly cynical on the potential.
Any other thoughts? Very brief thoughts.
I mean, Georgina's right. Xi has made his mind up, and his longer term, he can see this is going to make Russia more dependent on China. And it's a long way away. What's the gain to him by siding with the West? Modi, Russia is his by far his biggest supplier of arms and defense equipment. I mean, the test for India is not over the immediate crisis. It's much further down the line, that as Russia becomes more dependent on China, at what point does India start to worry that their biggest defense supplier is falling under the influence of their big strategic adversary?
Well, thank you all, and my apologies to all of you who submitted really excellent questions, but we simply didn't have the time to raise them. The speakers could see them all, and hopefully we'll address them elsewhere. And I thank all the speakers for sharing their insights, Andrew, Georgina, David, and Rosa. And I pass on to the virtual mic over to Uta again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Before you all log off, can I really just say a massive word of thanks, in particular to Olesya, who's done wonderful chairing today. And I do note that although today's panel was really focused on Europe, and what we wanted to do was to bring, put Europe on the spot, and that was one of the reasons why we put the panel together the way we did. She has given a fantastic keynote the other day for the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies, where she actually pointed out that sort of West-splaining attitude, amongst other reasons, sometimes also within the community. The talk is entitled, "Where is Ukraine on the Mental Map of the Academic Community?" And I'm going to put this in the chat, the YouTube channeling of it, so that you can see it for yourself. I also want to thank all the panelists from our end, from the European Institute and from SSEES. And I particularly also want to thank Lucy Shackleton, who is Head of Public Policies and Partnerships at UCL at the Institute, and has been the brains and the driving force behind this. So a big thank you to everyone, and a note also that the recording will be made available shortly. So thank you very much.